The homeless veteran stood at the auction with $3 and nothing left to lose, bidding on a wild colt that had already hospitalized 3 trainers. 6 months later, what that cursed horse did would prove that everyone had been wrong about who was really broken. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The morning sun barely broke through the gray clouds hanging over the small town of Meadowbrook, casting long shadows across the dusty livestock auction grounds. Thomas Miller stood at the edge of the crowd, his weathered hands buried deep in the pockets of his worn military jacket. The fabric was faded, the patches sewn on by his own unsteady hands, but it was all he had left from his days of service. At 62 years old, with a grizzled beard that had turned mostly white and eyes that had seen too much, Thomas looked every bit the broken man he felt inside. He had arrived at the auction grounds before dawn, walking the 3 miles from the abandoned warehouse where he'd been sleeping for the past 2 months. His legs ached with each step, the old shrapnel wounds from Vietnam reminding him of battles long past. But Thomas had heard about the auction from another veteran at the shelter, and something had compelled him to come. Perhaps it was the desperate hope that he might find something, anything, to give his life meaning again. The auction yard was filling up with ranchers, farmers, and horse traders, all talking in loud voices about bloodlines and training potential. Thomas felt invisible among them, just another shadow at the periphery. He reached into his pocket and felt the 3 crumpled dollar bills there, the sum total of everything he owned in the world. He had earned them the day before, helping an elderly woman carry groceries to her car. She had pressed the money into his hand despite his protests, her kind eyes seeing past his ragged appearance to the dignity he tried so hard to maintain. The auctioneer's voice crackled through the loudspeakers, announcing the beginning of the sale. Horse after horse was led into the ring, each one met with enthusiastic bidding. Thomas watched with quiet interest, remembering the horses from his childhood on his family's small farm in Kentucky. That felt like a lifetime ago, before the war, before the nightmares, before everything fell apart. Then came lot, number 17. A hush fell over the crowd as a young colt was led into the ring. The animal was unlike any Thomas had seen that morning. Its coat was a strange mottled pattern, patches of white and gray that seemed to shift in the uncertain light. But it was the colt's eyes that caught Thomas's attention, wild and frightened, rolling white with terror as the handler struggled to control it. The colt reared up, nearly pulling free, its hooves striking the air in panic. Thomas heard the murmurs ripple through the crowd like a dark wave. "Cursed," someone whispered behind him. "That's the cursed colt from the Henderson place." The Henderson ranch had been in the news weeks earlier. 3 trainers had been injured trying to break the young horse, and the rancher's son had suffered a broken arm. Superstition had taken root in the small community, and now everyone believed the animal carried some kind of curse that had brought nothing but bad luck to anyone who tried to tame it. The auctioneer's enthusiasm faltered as he looked out at the silent crowd. "All right, folks, we've got a fine young colt here, just needs the right hand. Let's start the bidding at $500. The silence stretched on, broken only by the colt's frightened snorts and the scrape of its hooves against the wooden floor. 400, 300. The auctioneer's voice grew more desperate. 200. Anybody? Thomas felt something stir in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. He looked at the terrified animal, seeing in its wild eyes a reflection of his own fear, his own desperate struggle to survive in a world that had labeled him as broken, as cursed, as beyond saving. The colt bucked again, and Thomas saw the handler raise his hand as if to strike it. Without thinking, without understanding why, Thomas raised his hand. $3, he called out, his voice rough from disuse but steady. The crowd turned to look at him, some with amusement, others with disdain. The auctioneer squinted in his direction, clearly wondering if he had heard correctly. $3? "Did you say $3, sir?" Thomas nodded, his hand still raised, his heart pounding. "It's all I have." A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. Someone behind Thomas muttered about homeless people wasting everyone's time. The auctioneer looked uncomfortable, glancing at the Colt and then back at Thomas. But before he could respond, the ranch owner stepped forward, a tall man named Henderson with a weathered face and cold eyes. "Sold," Henderson said flatly. $3. Just get that animal off my property." The crowd erupted in shocked whispers. The auctioneer hesitated, then brought his gavel down with a sharp crack. "Sold to the gentleman in the back for $3. Thomas stood frozen, unable to believe what had just happened. He had just bought a horse with his last $3, a horse that everyone said was cursed, a horse he had no way to feed or shelter. Around him, people shook their heads in disbelief, already dismissing him as just another crazy homeless man. But as Thomas made his way to the holding pen, as he approached the wild-eyed colt that was now his, something passed between them. The colt stopped thrashing for just a moment, and in that brief stillness, Thomas saw recognition in those frightened eyes. They were two survivors, two beings the world had given up on, two souls everyone had labeled as cursed and broken beyond repair. Thomas stood outside the holding pen, watching the ranch hands struggle to get a lead rope on the colt. The animal fought every touch, every attempt to control it, rearing and kicking with a desperation that Thomas understood all too well. Henderson approached him with a clipboard and a look of barely concealed contempt. "You need to sign here," he said, thrusting the papers forward, "and I want that animal off my property within the hour. Don't care how you do it, just get it gone." Thomas signed with a shaking hand, the reality of what he had done beginning to sink in. He had no truck, no trailer, no way to transport the colt. He had no land, no stable, nowhere to take it. He didn't even have $3 anymore. The enormity of his impulsive decision pressed down on him like a physical weight, and for a moment he wanted to walk away, to leave the colt here and disappear back into the anonymity of his homeless existence. But then he looked at the colt again, saw the terror in its eyes, and something in him refused to give up. He had made a promise when he raised his hand, even if he hadn't fully understood it. At the time, Thomas approached the pen slowly, ignoring the warnings from the ranch hands. "That thing's dangerous," one of them called out. "Already put 2 of our boys in the hospital." Thomas didn't respond. He simply opened the gate and stepped inside. The colt backed into the far corner, nostrils flaring, ears pinned flat against its head. Thomas could see the sweat darkening its mottled coat, could hear the labored breathing of an animal pushed to the edge of its endurance. He didn't move toward it, didn't reach out his hand. Instead, he sat down right there in the dirt, crossing his legs and lowering his gaze. He had learned something in the war, in the years of fighting and surviving, that fear could only be met with calm, that trust had to be earned through patience. The minutes stretched on. The ranch hands eventually wandered away, muttering about crazy old men. Henderson checked his watch impatiently, but said nothing. And Thomas simply sat, breathing slowly, letting the colt see that he posed no threat. He began to speak, his voice low and steady, talking about nothing in particular. He told the colt about Kentucky, about the farm he grew up on, about the first horse he ever rode when he was 7 years old. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the colt's breathing began to calm. Its ears swiveled forward, listening to the rumble of Thomas's voice. Thomas continued talking, sharing stories he hadn't spoken aloud in decades, memories that had been locked away with all the other pieces of his former life. He talked about his time in the service, about the friends he had lost, about coming home to a country that didn't know what to do with broken soldiers. He talked about his wife, who had left him when the nightmares became too much, about the jobs he couldn't keep, about the slow descent into the streets. The colt took a tentative step forward, then another. Thomas kept his eyes down, kept talking, kept his body language open and non-threatening. He understood what this animal was feeling because he had felt it himself for so many years. That bone-deep terror of being hurt again, that instinct to fight or flee because trusting had only ever led to pain. After what felt like an eternity, Thomas felt warm breath on his weathered hands. The Colt had come close enough to investigate him, its soft muzzle tentatively touching his knuckles. Thomas remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. The Colt sniffed his jacket, his beard seeming to catalog everything about this strange human who sat so calmly in its space. Then, with a gentleness that surprised Thomas, the Colt lowered its head and rested it briefly against his shoulder. The gesture lasted only a moment before the animal pulled back, but it was enough. Something had shifted between them. Some unspoken understanding had been reached. Thomas slowly stood up, his old joints protesting the movement. The Colt watched him but didn't retreat. "I'm going to call you Freedom," Thomas said quietly. "Because that's what we both need, isn't it? A chance to be free from what everyone says we are." The Colt's ears flicked forward at the sound of its new name, and Thomas could have sworn he saw something change in those wild eyes, a spark of hope perhaps, or recognition. Henderson appeared at the fence looking shocked. "I'll be damned," he muttered. "Never seen that horse let anyone get that close." Thomas turned to face him. "I need to move him, but I don't have a way to transport him." Henderson studied Thomas for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed, a sound of resignation. "You can walk him out if you can get a lead on him. There's an old rope halter in the tack room, but you've got 30 minutes, then I'm calling animal control." Thomas nodded his thanks and made his way to the tack room. The halter he found was frayed and old, but it would serve. When he returned to the pen, he moved slowly, showing the halter to Freedom, letting the Colt sniff it and understand what it was. Then, with movements born of patience and respect, Thomas slipped it over Freedom's head. The Colt tensed, but didn't fight, as if understanding that this man was different from the others who had tried to break its spirit. Thomas opened the gate and stepped out, the lead rope loose in his hand. Freedom followed him without resistance. The walk through town was unlike anything Thomas had experienced in years. He moved slowly down Main Street with Freedom walking beside him, the Colt's hooves clicking rhythmically against the pavement. People stopped on the sidewalks to stare, pointing and whispering. Thomas heard fragments of their conversations floating through the air. "That's the cursed horse from Henderson's place. What's that homeless man doing with it? Someone's going to get killed." Thomas kept his eyes forward, one hand gently holding the lead rope, the other occasionally reaching out to stroke Freedom's neck when the Colt grew nervous at passing cars or sudden noises. The animal stayed close to him, as if Thomas were the only solid thing in a world full of threats. They made an unusual pair. The broken-down veteran in his threadbare military jacket and the wild Colt everyone had given up on, walking together through a town that had no place for either of them. As they reached the edge of town, Thomas felt the weight of reality pressing down on him again. Where was he taking Freedom? He had been sleeping in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts, a crumbling brick building that offered shelter from the rain, but little else. There was no pasture there, no stable, not even a proper fence. He had no money for feed, no resources to care for an animal. The practical part of his mind screamed that he had made a terrible mistake, that he should turn around and surrender the Colt to animal control before things got worse. But then Freedom nickered softly, a gentle sound that seemed to ask where they were going, and Thomas found he couldn't give up. Not yet. Not on this creature that had trusted him when it had trusted no one else. He altered their path, heading instead toward the old Miller property on the far side of town. It had once belonged to his family, generations of Millers who had worked that land and raised horses on it. But that was before the war, before Thomas had lost everything. The property had been sold off years ago to pay his debts. Still, Thomas remembered that there was an old abandoned barn on the back 40 acres, a structure the new owners had never bothered to tear down, because it sat so far from the main house. If he could get Freedom there, if they could just have one night of shelter, maybe Thomas could figure out what to do next. It was a long shot, probably trespassing, but he was out of options. The sun was beginning to set as they finally reached the old barn. Thomas felt a wave of relief wash over him when he saw it was still standing, though barely. The roof sagged in places and boards were missing from the walls, but it was shelter. More importantly, there was a small fenced paddock behind it, overgrown with weeds but still intact. Thomas led Freedom inside the barn, his eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the gaps in the walls. The interior was dusty and filled with old hay that had long since turned brittle and gray. But Thomas found a corner that seemed relatively dry and secure. He removed the halter from Freedom's head, half expecting the colt to bolt now that it was free. But Freedom simply stood there. Watching him with those intelligent eyes, Thomas gathered some of the less moldy hay and spread it in the corner, creating a makeshift bed. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since the previous day, but his hunger seemed insignificant compared to the colt's needs. Thomas left the barn and walked the perimeter of the property, looking for anything edible for Freedom. He found a patch of clover growing wild near an old fence line and carefully pulled up as much as he could carry, bringing it back to the barn. Freedom ate cautiously at first, then with more enthusiasm, and Thomas felt a small victory in that simple act of providing food. As darkness fell, Thomas sat against the barn wall, watching Freedom settle down in the hay. The night sounds of the countryside surrounded them, crickets chirping and the distant hoot of an owl. Thomas had spent so many nights on the streets, in shelters, in doorways, always alone with his thoughts and his nightmares. But tonight felt different. There was another heartbeat in the darkness, another soul that depended on him. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Thomas felt needed, not pitied, not dismissed, but genuinely needed by another living being. Freedom's breathing had settled into a peaceful rhythm, and Thomas found himself talking again, his voice soft in the darkness. "I don't know what I'm doing here, boy. I don't have any answers. I can't even take care of myself most days. But maybe that's okay. Maybe we don't need to have all the answers right now. Maybe we just need to survive one day at a time, you and me together." As if in response, Freedom lifted his head and looked at Thomas through the darkness. And in that moment, Thomas felt something he thought he had lost forever in the jungles of Vietnam. He felt hope. It was a fragile thing, as delicate as spiderwebs in morning dew, but it was real. This Colt, this creature everyone had called cursed and dangerous, had somehow reached through all of Thomas's walls and reminded him what it felt like to care about something beyond his own survival. Thomas pulled his jacket tighter against the evening chill and closed his eyes. Tomorrow would bring new problems, new challenges he had no idea how to solve. He would need to find food for Freedom, water, proper shelter. He would need to figure out how to keep them both alive. But tonight, in this forgotten barn with this unlikely companion, Thomas allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had both found what they were looking for. Thomas woke before dawn to the sound of Freedom moving restlessly in the barn. The old veteran's body ached from sleeping on the hard ground, his back protesting every movement as he pushed himself upright. In the pale gray light filtering through the cracks in the barn walls, he could see the colt standing near the door, ears pricked forward, alert to something Thomas couldn't yet perceive. Then he heard it too, the sound of an approaching vehicle on the dirt road. His heart sank. Someone had discovered them already. Thomas stood slowly, his joints stiff from the cold night, and moved to the barn door. Through a gap in the weathered boards, he watched as an old pickup truck came to a stop near the barn. The driver's door opened, and an elderly man climbed out, moving with the careful deliberation of someone well into their 80s. Thomas recognized him immediately. It was Walter Chen, the man who had bought the Miller property all those years ago. Thomas stepped out of the barn, ready to apologize for trespassing, ready to gather freedom and move on. But Walter's weathered face broke into a smile that stopped Thomas in his tracks. "Thomas Miller," the old man said, his voice carrying the trace of an accent from his childhood in China. "I thought that might be you I saw walking through town yesterday. Heard you had bought yourself that wild horse everyone's been talking about." Thomas nodded, uncertain what to say. "I'm sorry for using your barn, Mr. Chen. We'll be moving on. We just needed somewhere for the night." Walter waved his hand dismissively. "Moving on to where? You got family around here? A place to keep that animal?" Thomas shook his head, feeling the familiar shame creeping up his neck. "No, sir. I don't have anywhere to go." Walter looked past Thomas to where Freedom stood in the barn doorway, the colt's eyes wide and cautious. "That's what I thought," Walter said. He walked to the back of his truck and lowered the tailgate, revealing several bales of fresh hay, a bag of grain, and a large water container. "I remember when your grandfather built this barn, Thomas. 1942, right before you were born. It was a good barn then, could be a good barn again with a little work." Thomas stared at the old man, not understanding. "Mr. Chen, I can't pay you for any of this. I don't have any money. I don't have anything." Walter began pulling a hay bale from the truck bed. "I know that, son. I also know what it's like to have nothing. You remember me telling you about the internment camps during the war?" Thomas nodded slowly. His grandfather had told him stories about Walter Chen's family being forced from their home during World War II, losing everything they had built. Walter continued, his movements steady despite his age. "After the camps, we had nothing. Not a penny to our names, but people helped us. Your grandfather was one of them. He gave my father work on this very property, helped us get back on our feet. I always told myself if I ever had the chance to pay that kindness forward, I would." He looked directly at Thomas. "Seems like now's that time." Thomas felt something catch in his throat, an emotion he couldn't quite name. "Mr. Chen, I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," Walter replied. "You just need to take care of that horse and start taking care of yourself. This barn hasn't been used in 20 years. You fix it up, make it sound again, and you and that colt can stay here as long as you need. There's a hand pump out back that still works, and I'll bring feed once a week." "But why?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do this for me?" Walter smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. "Because I've seen that look in a man's eyes before. That look that says you've given up on yourself, but you're still trying to save something else. That's how my father looked when your grandfather gave him that chance. And I'll tell you what your grandfather told him. Sometimes we don't save ourselves for our own sake. We do it for the sake of those who depend on us." Thomas looked back at Freedom, who was watching the exchange with ears forward, seeming to sense that something important was happening. The colt's presence had already changed something in Thomas, had awakened a part of him he thought was dead. Walter was right. He might not be able to save himself, but he could try to save Freedom, and maybe in doing that, he would find his own salvation. Over the next hour, Walter helped Thomas unload the supplies and showed him where everything was on the property. The hand pump did indeed still work, producing clear cold water that Freedom drank eagerly. Walter explained that the paddock fence would need mending, and there were boards missing from the barn that would need replacing. "I've got materials you can use," he said. "Consider it payment for keeping the place from falling down completely." As Walter prepared to leave, he paused and turned back to Thomas. "One more thing. There's a veterans center in town, opens at 9 every weekday. They've got job listings, counseling, help with benefits. My nephew volunteers there. His name is David Chen. I'll tell him to expect you." Thomas wanted to protest, to say he didn't need charity, but the words died in his throat. He did need help. He had needed help for a long time, but had been too proud or too broken to accept it. "Thank you," Thomas finally said, the words inadequate for what he was feeling. Walter nodded. "Don't thank me, son. Just do the work. Take care of that horse, fix up this barn, and when you're steady on your feet again, you help someone else who needs it. That's how kindness works. It keeps moving forward." The days that followed fell into a rhythm Thomas hadn't known in years. He woke each morning with the sun, his first thought always of freedom. The colt needed water, needed feed, needed someone to check him over for injuries or illness. For so long, Thomas had woken with nothing to live for, nothing to pull him from the darkness of his nightmares. Now he had a purpose, even if that purpose was just keeping one wild colt alive. Thomas began working on the barn in earnest. Walter had been true to his word, delivering lumber, nails, and tools that first week. Thomas's hands, roughened by years on the streets, but still remembering the skills his grandfather had taught him, took up hammer and saw with a familiarity that surprised him. He worked slowly at first, his body unaccustomed to sustained labor, but each day he grew a little stronger. Each board he replaced, each gap he sealed, felt like a small victory against the decay that had claimed so much of his life. Freedom watched him work, the colt's curiosity growing bolder with each passing day. At first, Freedom kept his distance, observing from the far corner of the paddock, but gradually, drawn by Thomas's calm presence and steady voice, the colt began to venture closer. Thomas talked while he worked, sharing his thoughts aloud in a way he never had with another human being. He told Freedom about the nightmares that still came most nights, about the brothers in arms he had lost, about the guilt that had eaten away at him for decades. The colt listened with pricked ears, occasionally nickering softly, as if in understanding. There was something healing in having a listener who didn't judge, who didn't offer empty platitudes or uncomfortable sympathy. Freedom simply accepted Thomas's words, accepted his presence, accepted him exactly as he was. In return, Thomas began to accept himself a little more each day. One morning, as Thomas was repairing a section of the paddock fence, Freedom approached and stood close enough that Thomas could feel the warmth of the colt's body. Without thinking, Thomas reached out and rested his hand on Freedom's neck. The colt didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, Freedom leaned slightly into the touch, a gesture of trust that brought tears to Thomas's weathered eyes. In that moment, Thomas understood that they were healing each other, two broken souls finding wholeness in their unlikely friendship. True to his word, Walter had told his nephew David about Thomas. The following Monday, Thomas walked into town to visit the Veterans Center. His pride still stung at needing help, but Freedom's depending on him gave him the courage to push through that pride. David Chen was a young man in his 30s, a veteran himself from the Gulf War. He greeted Thomas without pity, without the careful distance Thomas had grown accustomed to seeing in people's eyes. David helped Thomas navigate the complex process of applying for veterans' benefits that he should have been receiving for years. He explained that Thomas was entitled to health care through the VA, to disability compensation for his service-connected injuries, to support services that could help him get back on his feet. The paperwork was overwhelming, the bureaucracy frustrating, but David was patient, walking Thomas through each form, each requirement. Over the following weeks, Thomas made regular trips to the Veterans Center. He attended a support group for veterans with PTSD, sitting in a circle with other men and women who understood the weight he carried. At first, he said nothing, just listened to their stories, hearing echoes of his own experiences in their words. But gradually, encouraged by their acceptance, Thomas began to speak. He talked about the war, about the things he had seen and done, about the way he had let those memories poison everything good in his life. The group didn't offer easy answers or quick fixes, but they offered something more valuable. They offered understanding. These were people who knew what it meant to carry invisible wounds, who knew the struggle of trying to live a normal life when part of you was still trapped in a war zone. They celebrated his small victories, like finding the barn and caring for freedom, and they supported him through his setbacks, like the nights when the nightmares were so bad he couldn't sleep at all. Back at the barn, Thomas's work continued. He replaced the entire roof over the course of 3 weeks, working section by section to ensure freedom always had shelter. He mended every gap in the walls, installed a proper door that closed securely, and even built a small tack room where he could store feed and supplies. The barn was transforming under his hands, becoming not just a shelter but a home. Freedom was transforming too. The wild, terrified Colt, who had fought every human touch, was becoming a confident young horse. Thomas worked with him gently, never forcing, never rushing. He taught Freedom to accept a halter without fear, to walk on a lead without pulling, to stand calmly while Thomas groomed his mottled coat. There was no harsh training, no breaking of spirit. Instead, there was partnership, trust building slowly and surely between them. People in town began to notice the changes. Thomas, once invisible or dismissed as just another homeless veteran, was becoming someone they recognized and respected. They saw him walking Freedom through town in the early mornings, both of them moving with quiet dignity. They saw the work he was doing on the old barn, the care he was putting into restoring it. Some of the old-timers remembered Thomas's grandfather and began to stop and talk, sharing memories and offering words of encouragement. The owner of the local feed store, a gruff man named Bill Morrison, approached Thomas one afternoon. "Heard you're doing good work out at the old Miller place," Bill said without preamble. "I could use some help around here on weekends, unloading trucks, stocking shelves. Pays not much, but it's honest work if you're interested." Thomas accepted Bill's offer, and for the first time in over a decade, he had steady work. The job was physically demanding, but Thomas found that his body was growing stronger from the weeks of barn repairs and caring for Freedom. More importantly, the work gave him structure and purpose beyond just survival. He earned enough to buy his own supplies for Freedom, to contribute something to Walter for the use of the land, and even to set aside a small amount in savings. With his first paycheck, Thomas bought new grooming brushes for Freedom and a proper leather halter to replace the frayed rope one. The second paycheck went toward replacing his worn-out boots and buying a few changes of clothes from the thrift store. He was still far from wealthy, still living day to day, but he was no longer destitute. The transformation was gradual but undeniable. Thomas was rebuilding not just the barn, but his entire life. As winter approached, Thomas worked with renewed urgency to prepare the barn. He insulated the walls with materials Walter helped him source, installed storm shutters over the windows, and stockpiled hay and grain. Freedom would need extra nutrition to maintain his weight through the cold months, and Thomas was determined that the colt would never know hunger or cold under his care. The bond between them had deepened into something profound, something that went beyond the simple relationship between a man and his horse. One evening, as Thomas was brushing Freedom's coat, he noticed something that made him pause. The mottled patches that had given the colt such an unusual appearance were changing. What had been random splotches of white and gray were starting to form a pattern, a striking contrast that made Freedom look almost majestic. Thomas stepped back to observe the full effect, and he realized that what everyone had seen as evidence of a curse was actually the beginning of something beautiful. Freedom had grown considerably in the months since Thomas had brought him to the barn. His body had filled out with proper nutrition, his coat gleamed with health, and his movements had lost their frantic, fearful quality. He carried himself with confidence now, his head high, his stride purposeful. The transformation was remarkable, and Thomas felt a fierce pride in what they had accomplished together. This was no longer the cursed colt that had been rejected and feared. This was a magnificent young horse with spirit and intelligence shining in his eyes. The people of Meadowbrook had noticed the change too. On Thomas's walks through town with Freedom, folks no longer crossed to the other side of the street. Instead, they stopped to admire the horse, to comment on how well he looked, to ask Thomas about his training methods. Children begged their parents to let them pet Freedom, and the Colt, once so wild and unapproachable, accepted their gentle touches with patient grace. One of those who took particular notice was Sarah Bennett, a woman in her 50s who ran the local animal rescue. She had heard the stories about the cursed Colt and the homeless veteran, and she came out to the barn one Saturday afternoon to see for herself. Thomas was working with Freedom in the paddock when she arrived, teaching the Colt to respond to voice commands without a lead rope. The level of trust and communication between them was immediately apparent. Sarah introduced herself and watched for nearly an hour as Thomas worked with Freedom. Finally, she spoke. "I've been working with animals for 30 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this. That horse trusts you completely." Thomas smiled, running his hand along Freedom's neck. "He saved my life, so I figured the least I could do was earn that trust." Sarah's expression grew thoughtful. "I'm organizing a charity event next month, a fundraiser for the Veterans Center. We're going to have demonstrations, displays, that sort of thing. I was wondering if you and Freedom might be willing to participate. Show people what you've accomplished together. It would mean a lot to the community, and it might help other veterans see that there's hope for recovery." Thomas felt a flutter of anxiety at the thought of being in front of a crowd, of being the center of attention. The old shame tried to rise up, telling him that he was still just a broken-down homeless man with no right to present himself as any kind of example. But then Freedom nuzzled his shoulder, and Thomas remembered how far they had both come. Maybe their story could help someone else, the way Walter's kindness had helped him. "I'll do it," Thomas said quietly. "If you think it might help someone, we'll do it." Sarah's face lit up with a warm smile. "I know it will help. Sometimes people need to see that redemption is possible, that it's never too late to start over. You and Freedom are living proof of that." The weeks leading up to the event were filled with preparation. Thomas worked with Freedom every day, refining their communication, building their partnership. He wasn't trying to create a performance or a spectacle. Instead, he wanted to demonstrate the genuine connection they had built, the mutual trust that had transformed both of their lives. David from the Veterans Center helped Thomas prepare what he would say, but they agreed that the demonstration itself would speak louder than any words. As the day of the event approached, Thomas felt a mix of nervousness and anticipation. He had never been comfortable being the focus of attention, preferring to remain invisible, unnoticed. But he had learned something important over these past months. Hiding in the shadows didn't protect you from pain. It only isolated you from the possibility of connection, of healing, of hope. The morning of the event dawned clear and cold. Thomas rose early as always, taking extra time to groom Freedom until his coat shone. The Colt seemed to sense that something special was happening. His ears pricked forward with interest, his movements full of energy. Thomas dressed in his best clothes, which still weren't much, but they were clean and mended. He looked at his reflection in the small mirror he had hung in the tack room and barely recognized the man staring back at him. The community center was already bustling with activity when Thomas arrived with Freedom. Vendors were setting up booths, volunteers were arranging chairs, and a small stage had been erected at one end of the parking lot. Sarah Bennett spotted them immediately and hurried over, her face bright with excitement. "You made it." "I was worried the crowd might be too much." Thomas glanced around at the growing number of people and felt his chest tighten with familiar anxiety. But Freedom stood calmly beside him, a steady presence that anchored him. Sarah led them to a cordoned-off area where they could wait before their demonstration. Other participants were there as well, therapy dogs and their handlers, service animals of various kinds, all part of showcasing how animals could help veterans heal. Thomas felt out of place among these official programs with their certifications and structured training methods. He was just a man with a horse, two outcasts who had found each other by chance. As Thomas waited, he noticed people gathering near the fence to look at Freedom. The Colt had become something of a local celebrity. His transformation from the cursed horse to this magnificent animal, a story that had spread throughout Meadowbrook. Children pointed and asked their parents if they could come closer. Thomas heard whispers of recognition, people recounting what they had heard about him and Freedom. Some of the comments were kind, but others carried the edge of skepticism. "That's the homeless guy who bought the crazy horse for $3. Wonder if it's all just luck that he hasn't been killed yet." Thomas felt the old shame trying to creep back in, that voice telling him he was a fraud, that any moment now everyone would see him for what he really was, a broken man who couldn't even keep his own life together, let alone train a horse. His hands began to tremble slightly, and his breathing grew shallow. The familiar signs of panic were building, the same panic that had derailed so many attempts to rebuild his life over the years. But then Freedom turned his head and looked directly at Thomas, those intelligent eyes seeming to see right through to his soul. The Colt nickered softly and took a step closer, pressing his warm body against Thomas's side. The contact was grounding, pulling Thomas back from the edge of panic. Freedom had trusted him when trust seemed impossible. Freedom had followed him when everyone said the horse was too wild, too dangerous, too cursed. If this magnificent animal could have faith in him, maybe Thomas could have a little faith in himself. The demonstration before theirs finished to enthusiastic applause, and Sarah appeared at Thomas's side. "You're up next. Are you ready?" Thomas took a deep breath, his hand resting on Freedom's neck, drawing strength from the solid warmth beneath his palm, as ready as I'll ever be. They walked together into the demonstration area, and Thomas was surprised by how many people had gathered. There must have been 200 folks there, maybe more, all watching him with varying degrees of curiosity and expectation. Sarah took the microphone and began to introduce them. 6 months ago, this horse was considered dangerous and cursed. 3 trainers had been injured trying to break him, and his owner was so desperate to be rid of him that he sold him at auction. The only person willing to take a chance on him was Thomas Miller, a homeless veteran who had just $3 to his name. What you're about to see isn't the result of professional training or expensive techniques. It's the result of patience, trust, and 2 broken souls helping each other heal. The crowd quieted as Sarah handed the microphone to Thomas. His hand shook slightly as he took it, his mouth dry with nervousness. "I'm not much of a speaker," he began, his voice rough but steady, "and I'm not a professional horse trainer. 6 months ago, I was sleeping in abandoned buildings, convinced my life was over, convinced I had nothing left to give. Then I met Freedom." The Colt stood beside him, calm and attentive, as if he understood the importance of this moment. Thomas continued, the words coming easier now. "Everyone said this horse was cursed. Everyone said he was dangerous, that he'd never be tamed. But I looked at him and saw something familiar. I saw fear. I saw a creature that had been hurt and abandoned, that fought back because fighting was the only way he knew to protect himself. And I understood that, because that's exactly how I felt." Thomas paused, gathering his thoughts. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on his every word. "We didn't fix each other overnight," Thomas said. "We're still not fixed. But we learned to trust each other, one small step at a time. Freedom taught me that healing isn't about becoming who you were before. It's about accepting who you are now and building something new from there." He set down the microphone and turned to Freedom, and what happened next was something they had never rehearsed. Something that came purely from the bond they shared. Thomas stepped away from Freedom, removing the lead rope entirely. The Colt was completely free, able to run if he chose, able to leave. But Freedom didn't move. Thomas walked to the far end of the demonstration area, perhaps 50 feet away, and turned to face the Colt. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the distance. Then Thomas held out his hand and called softly, just one word: freedom. The Colt's ears pricked forward, and without hesitation, Freedom began to walk toward Thomas. Not rushing, not nervous, just a steady, confident approach. The crowd watched in amazement as the horse, who had once been too wild to touch, walked calmly across the space and came to stand beside Thomas, pressing his head against the veteran's chest in a gesture of pure affection and trust. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Thomas barely heard it. He was focused entirely on Freedom, his arms wrapped around the Colt's neck, feeling the strong heartbeat beneath the sleek coat. This moment, this connection, was what mattered. Everything else fell away. The crowd, the noise, the expectations. There was only this profound bond between two souls who had saved each other. When Thomas finally looked up, he saw tears on many faces in the crowd. Sarah was wiping her eyes, and even some of the gruff old ranchers who had witnessed the original auction were visibly moved. Thomas picked up the microphone again, his voice thick with emotion. If someone like me can find hope, if a horse everyone gave up on can become this, then none of us are beyond saving. That's what Freedom taught me. We're not defined by our worst moments or our deepest fears. We're defined by our willingness to keep trying, to trust again, to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. After the demonstration, Thomas was surrounded by people wanting to talk, to share their own stories, to thank him for his courage in speaking so openly. Veterans came forward, some with tears streaming down their faces, telling him they had felt the same hopelessness, the same conviction that they were broken beyond repair. Parents of troubled children asked for advice. People struggling with their own demons sought some piece of wisdom that might help them find their way. Thomas felt overwhelmed by the attention, but he tried to listen to each person, to offer what comfort he could. He wasn't a therapist or a counselor. He was just a man who had been drowning and had found something worth swimming for. But he shared what he knew, that healing took time, that you couldn't do it alone, that sometimes salvation came from the most unexpected places. Among the people who approached was a woman Thomas didn't recognize at first. She was well-dressed, probably in her late 50s, with kind eyes that held a deep sadness. She waited patiently until the crowd thinned, then stepped forward. "Mr. Miller, my name is Margaret Henderson. I'm Robert Henderson's sister." Thomas felt his body tense at the name. Henderson was the rancher who had owned Freedom, who had sold him for $3 just to be rid of him. Margaret continued, her voice soft. "My brother called me after you bought Freedom. He was angry at first, thought you were making a fool of him, but I've been following your progress, and I came today to see for myself." She paused, her eyes moving to Freedom. "That horse destroyed my brother's pride. 3 professional trainers couldn't handle him, and Robert couldn't stand having a failure in his stables. But watching you two together, I finally understand something. Freedom wasn't the failure, Robert was." Thomas didn't know what to say. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "Inside, this is the registration papers for Freedom, his bloodline, his pedigree. My brother never told you, but that colt comes from championship stock, worth tens of thousands of dollars. His father was a national champion." Thomas stared at the envelope in shock. Margaret pressed it into his hands. "He's yours legally already, but I wanted you to know what you have. More importantly, I wanted to apologize for my brother treating him and you so poorly." The revelation about Freedom's bloodline spread quickly through the crowd, adding another layer to the already remarkable story. The cursed colt wasn't just any horse. He was potentially one of the most valuable animals in the region. People began speculating about what Thomas would do with this newfound knowledge. Would he sell Freedom? Would he try to train him for competition? The questions came fast, and Thomas felt the pressure building again. But as he looked at Freedom, standing calmly beside him despite the chaos and noise, Thomas knew exactly what he would do. Nothing would change. Freedom wasn't valuable to him because of his bloodline or his potential worth. Freedom was valuable because of who he was, because of the bond they shared, because he had given Thomas a reason to live when living had seemed impossible. No amount of money could match that value. In the weeks following the demonstration, Thomas's life changed in ways he never anticipated. The local newspaper ran a feature story about him and freedom, complete with photographs and interviews. The story was picked up by larger papers, then by regional news stations. Suddenly, the quiet transformation happening in the old barn became a symbol of hope for people across the state. Donations began arriving at the Veterans Center in Thomas's name. People sent money to help other homeless veterans. Inspired by his story to take action, the center was able to expand its programs, hire additional counselors, and provide more comprehensive services. David Chen called Thomas to tell him that 3 veterans who had been living on the streets had come in seeking help, specifically mentioning Thomas's story as their motivation to try again. Thomas also received offers, lots of them. Horse trainers wanted to take freedom and develop his potential. Wealthy buyers offered sums of money that made Thomas's head spin. A film production company even approached about buying the rights to his story. Thomas politely declined every offer. Freedom wasn't for sale, and neither was their story. What they had built together wasn't a commodity to be marketed. It was something sacred, something that belonged only to them. But Thomas did accept one opportunity. A therapeutic riding center an hour away asked if he would be willing to volunteer to work with troubled youth and veterans using the gentle methods he had developed with freedom. The center's director had seen the demonstration and believed Thomas had a gift for understanding wounded souls, both human and animal. Winter settled over Meadowbrook with a blanket of snow that transformed the landscape into something clean and new. Thomas had never been fond of winter, the cold always making his old injuries ache. But this year felt different. The barn was warm and solid, freedom was healthy and content, and Thomas had a sense of belonging he hadn't felt since before the war. He continued his work at the feed store, his volunteering at the therapeutic riding center, and his daily care of freedom, each piece of his life fitting together in a way that felt almost miraculous. It was late February, nearly 6 months to the day since Thomas had bought freedom at auction, when the miracle truly happened. Thomas was in the barn early that morning, mucking out Freedom's stall while the colt ate his breakfast. The routine had become meditative for Thomas, a time when his mind could settle and find peace. He was so absorbed in his work that he almost didn't hear the vehicle pulling up outside. Through the barn door, Thomas saw an expensive SUV, black and gleaming even in the gray winter light. A man stepped out, tall and impeccably dressed in a long wool coat that probably cost more than Thomas earned in 6 months. He looked around the property with an appraising eye, taking in the restored barn, the well-maintained paddock, and finally, Freedom himself. Thomas set down his pitchfork and walked out to meet the visitor, wiping his hands on his work pants. "Can I help you?" The man turned to face him, extending a hand. "My name is James Cartwright. I'm a horse breeder and trainer from Lexington. I've come a long way to see you and your colt." Thomas shook his hand, noting the firm grip and the calculating intelligence in the man's eyes. This was someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. Cartwright got right to the point. "I've been following your story, Mr. Miller. Quite remarkable, really. But I'm more interested in the horse than the human interest angle. I've done some research on Freedom's bloodline. His sire, Midnight Storm, was a champion. I trained myself years ago. When I heard that one of his offspring had surfaced, I had to see for myself." He gestured toward Freedom, who was watching them with alert interest from the paddock. That colt has the genetics to be worth a fortune, potentially millions if trained and bred correctly. Thomas felt a familiar wariness settle over him. He had heard variations of this speech before, always leading to an offer to buy freedom. "I appreciate you coming all this way, Mr. Cartwright, but freedom's not for sale. I've told others the same thing." Cartwright smiled, a practiced expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm not here to buy him, Mr. Miller. At least not yet. I'm here to offer you an opportunity." The man pulled out his phone and showed Thomas a video. It was footage of a horse race, a magnificent black stallion thundering down the track with devastating speed and power. "That's Midnight Storm in his prime," Cartwright explained. "Your freedom has that same fire, that same potential, but potential means nothing if it's not developed. I want to offer you a partnership. Let me train Freedom, prepare him for competition. Any winnings we split 50-50 and you maintain ownership. You could be looking at millions, Mr. Miller. Enough to never worry about money again." Thomas watched the video, seeing the raw power and grace of the champion horse. He could imagine Freedom running like that, could picture the colt's mottled coat gleaming as he crossed finish lines. It was an intoxicating vision, the kind of success story that seemed impossible for someone like Thomas. But as he looked from the phone to Freedom standing peacefully in the paddock, he felt a deep certainty settle in his chest. "Mr. Cartwright, I understand you've come a long way, and I respect your expertise, but you're missing something important." Thomas walked over to the paddock fence, and Freedom immediately came to him, nuzzling his shoulder with familiar affection. "This horse isn't here to make me rich. He's here because we needed each other. I spent years thinking my worth was measured by what I could achieve, what I could accomplish. That kind of thinking nearly destroyed me." Cartwright's expression shifted, a flicker of genuine interest replacing the business facade. "Go on." Thomas continued, stroking Freedom's neck. "Freedom doesn't need to be a champion to be valuable. He doesn't need to win races or earn millions. He just needs to be himself, to live without fear, to know he's safe and loved. That's what he gave me, and that's what I give him in return. You can't put a price on that kind of peace." The horse trainer was quiet for a long moment, studying Thomas with new eyes. "You really mean that it's not a negotiating tactic?" Thomas nodded. "I really mean it. 6 months ago, I had $3 and no reason to wake up in the morning. Now I have a purpose, a home, a future. Freedom gave me all of that, not by being worth millions, but by teaching me that worth isn't measured in dollars." Cartwright looked at Freedom again, then back at Thomas. "You know, in 30 years of working with horses, I've seen a lot of partnerships. Most of them are transactional, owner and animal, master and servant. What you have here is different." He paused, seeming to struggle with his words. "I came here thinking I'd convince you to let me turn this colt into a champion. But watching you two together, I'm not sure that would be the right thing. For either of you," Thomas appreciated the honesty. "I hope you don't think your trip was wasted." Cartwright shook his head slowly. "Not at all. Sometimes we need to be reminded what truly matters." After Cartwright left, Thomas stood in the paddock with Freedom, the winter sun breaking through the clouds and casting long shadows across the snow. He thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, from that desperate morning at the auction to this peaceful afternoon. 6 months. Just 6 months since he had spent his last $3 on a horse everyone called cursed. It seemed like a lifetime ago. Spring arrived with its promise of renewal, and Thomas watched as the world around the barn came back to life. Wildflowers bloomed in the meadow beyond the paddock, and birds returned to nest in the rafters of the barn he had so carefully restored. Freedom had grown into a stunning horse, his once awkward frame now filled with muscle and grace. The mottled coat that had seemed strange now appeared striking, unique, beautiful in its unconventional pattern. Walter Chen visited often, always pleased to see the progress Thomas continued to make. The old man had become something of a grandfather figure to Thomas, offering wisdom and support without judgment. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch of the barn watching Freedom graze, Walter shared something he had never told Thomas before. "You know, when I gave you permission to use this barn, I wasn't sure you'd make it. I'd seen too many veterans disappear into their pain. But I also knew that sometimes all a person needs is one chance, one moment where someone believes in them." Thomas nodded, understanding the weight of those words. "You gave me more than a chance, Mr. Chen. You gave me back my dignity." Walter smiled, his weathered face creasing with warmth. "You gave that to yourself, Thomas. I just opened a door. You're the one who walked through it." The therapeutic riding center became an increasingly important part of Thomas's life. Every week he worked with young people and veterans who carried their own invisible wounds. He never claimed to be a therapist or an expert. He simply shared his story, introduced them to freedom, and showed them that healing was possible. The gentle Colt, who had once been too wild to touch, now stood patiently while troubled teenagers brushed his coat and whispered their secrets to him. One young veteran named Marcus, who had returned from Afghanistan with severe PTSD, came to the center after attempting suicide. He wouldn't speak to anyone, wouldn't engage with the counselors, seemed determined to remain locked in his private hell. But when he met Freedom, something shifted. The horse approached Marcus with the same gentle curiosity he had shown Thomas that first night in the barn, and Marcus, for the first time in months, reached out his hand. Thomas watched from a distance as Marcus and Freedom connected, seeing a mirror of his own journey in the young man's hesitant movements. Over the following weeks, Marcus returned again and again, spending hours with Freedom, eventually opening up to Thomas about his struggles. The bond between the horse and the troubled veteran became its own kind of therapy, proof that what Thomas and Freedom shared could extend beyond themselves to help others heal. As summer approached, Thomas made a decision. He contacted Sarah Bennett at the Animal Rescue and proposed creating a formal program at the barn, using Freedom and the space Walter had provided to work with veterans and at-risk youth. Sarah was enthusiastic about the idea and helped Thomas navigate the process of establishing a nonprofit organization. The paperwork was daunting, the legal requirements complex, but Thomas persevered, driven by a vision of transforming his second chance into opportunities for others. The program launched quietly in June, with just 3 participants, but word spread quickly through the Veterans Network, and by autumn, Thomas had a waiting list of people wanting to work with Freedom. He never charged for the sessions, relying instead on donations and his own work at the feed store to keep things running. The barn that had once been abandoned and forgotten became a sanctuary, a place where broken people and a once cursed horse created something beautiful together. On a crisp October morning, nearly a year after that fateful auction, Thomas stood in the paddock with Freedom, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. The Colt, now a magnificent yearling, stood beside him with the quiet confidence of an animal who knew he was loved and safe. Thomas thought about all the people who had told him Freedom was cursed, worthless, dangerous. He thought about his own conviction that he was beyond saving, that his life had no value or purpose. How wrong they had all been. Freedom had never been cursed. He had simply been misunderstood, mistreated, waiting for someone who could see past the fear to the potential underneath. And Thomas hadn't been beyond saving. He had just needed a reason to believe that tomorrow could be different from yesterday, that second chances were real, that even the most broken souls could find wholeness again. Thomas's phone buzzed with a text from David at the Veterans Center. "Another vet asking about your program. This one's been homeless for 5 years. Says he heard your story and wants to know if there's hope for him too." Thomas smiled and typed his response. "Tell him to come out tomorrow morning. There's always hope." As he put the phone away, Freedom nickered softly and pressed his head against Thomas's chest. That familiar gesture of trust and affection, that still moved Thomas every time he wrapped his arms around the horse's strong neck, feeling the steady heartbeat beneath the sleek coat. They had saved each other, this man and this horse, two beings the world had written off, proving that curses were nothing but lies, people told about things they didn't understand. The sun continued its climb into the sky, illuminating the restored barn, the green meadow, and the man and horse standing together in perfect peace. Thomas Miller, the homeless veteran who had spent his last $3 on a wild colt everyone called cursed, had found something worth more than all the money in the world. He had found purpose, healing, and hope. And 6 months after that desperate gamble, the real miracle wasn't just that they had both survived, it was that they had both learned to truly live.